Today, Thursday, 11th July, is the last day of the NATO summit meeting in Washington, and we're now starting to get the various documents appear. I've not had time, as of the making of this video, to go over those documents fully, but it seems to me that they are very much, from what I've been able to judge from them, very much in line with what one might have expected. Reaffirmations of the importance of the NATO alliance on the occasion of its 75th anniversary, simultaneous claims that the alliance is not seeking conflict with Russia, even though it goes on to make absolutely clear that it is in effect in conflict with Russia. Of course, when they talk about conflict, they mean out and out war. But as far as the Russians are concerned, they are being fought by the Ukrainians using NATO weapons, and the NATO powers are intimately and directly involved in the way in which the Ukrainians use those weapons. Perhaps intentionally, in fact, undoubtedly intentionally, on this very last day of the NATO summit meeting, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Agency, the SVR, has declassified and published a report from a Russian agent in France who goes by the codename Felix. And according to this report, French troops are in fact already involved in fighting in Ukraine. The French authorities are supposedly becoming increasingly concerned by the numbers of French troops fighting in Ukraine alongside the Russians who have already been killed, that there are supposedly concerns by the French authorities that if the extent of French involvement and of French casualties became public, that this would trigger significant alarm within France. And last but not least, there are claims that the French originally planned to deploy publicly 2,000 troops to Ukraine, and those plans, though they seem to have been, shall we say, de-emphasized for the moment, they still have not been fully shelved. Now, I have to say straight away that I'm somewhat skeptical about this release. Would Russian intelligence really declassify a document like this, provided by an agent such as Felix? One assumes that Felix, if he exists, is a Russian official. But why identify him? Why provide the French and NATO authorities with the clues that they might acquire from reading a document of this kind? And, well, of course, one can argue, if one wants to be cynical, that this whole document is essentially put together by the Russians, perhaps out of miscellaneous reports published under the pen name Felix, to give it some, shall we say, James Bondian quality, and to provide us with an insight of what the Russians think the chatter in France is, in a way that's clearly intended to crystallize doubts in France, but also to re-emphasize the key point that the Russians in Ukraine are effectively fighting NATO. Well, you can be as cynical about this document as you wish. I obviously am. But put all that aside, disregard, if you like, some of the details, or at least accept that those details may be unreliable, but the substance of what this document says is obviously true. There are indeed French and other NATO personnel in Ukraine. They are indeed heavily involved in the war. Many of them are playing an active role in assisting Ukraine to launch missiles, carry out missions of various kinds against the Russians. There have undoubtedly been casualties suffered by some NATO personnel, though I think it is impossible to give any estimate as to their number. Probably some fairly senior officials have died as a result. A couple of days ago, there was an announcement in the United States about the death of a US general, and some people, looking at the obituary notice, concluded that this senior military officer of the United States probably died on active service in Ukraine. That may be true, it may not, I've no way of saying. But anyway, the substance of this document is correct, even if one can be as skeptical as one wishes about the way it's been published and as cynical as one wishes about some of its contents. And it is the case that, as I said, NATO, despite its protestations of not seeking conflict with Russia, is indeed involved in a conflict with Russia in Ukraine. And, well, the NATO declaration goes on to say other things. It, of course, is harshly critical of the Russians, as one would expect. It talks about Ukraine and the fact that Ukraine deserves and will continue to receive support. It talks about Ukraine receiving another $1 billion worth of military equipment in terms of air defense, which, by the way, I would have thought is nowhere near as much as the Ukrainians themselves had been anticipating. And, of course, this document also makes incredibly harsh statements about China, demanding, which I find astonishing, by the way, that China end all cooperation with Russia. What right NATO has to make those kind of demands of the world's, well, what has until just a few years ago been the world's biggest, and which quite plausibly today is, economically speaking, the world's most powerful country, and, by the way, the world's oldest state. What right NATO has to make such demands of China is another matter. The Chinese never take well to demands of this kind, and as I will discuss in a moment, they have not done so. But anyway, it's increasingly clear, by the way, and that seems to be the overall thrust of most of these documents, that though the NATO is indeed now tied up in a confrontation with Russia in Ukraine, increasingly senior NATO officials are setting their sights on China. By the way, in focusing on China, I've even seen reports, though I've not yet found them in any of the NATO documents, but I've even seen reports that NATO officials have now taken to calling China Russia's direct accomplice, which is, again, extraordinary language. But anyway, even as the West NATO focuses on China in the way it is doing, it seems strange that they choose to disregard the equally close relationship between Russia and India. After all, you could argue that India is also helping Russia to circumvent the West's sanctions and is thereby facilitating Russia's war. I don't accept that interpretation in any way of India's actions. India is trading with Russia, as every country should have the right to trade with any other country. And in the case of China, it is the same. But the self-appointed shapers of the destiny of the world in Washington, meeting in Washington, clearly think otherwise. And anyway, I get very much the sense from all of these documents that NATO principally is focusing on China and China's relationship with Russia, not because they're so angry, they're particularly angry or object especially to what China is doing with respect to Russia, but because the United States, to which all the NATO countries are attached in one form or another, has come to see China as its greatest potential rival, as a threat to its position as the world's leading power, and as a result, the Americans have effectively called on their allies to support them in this confrontation with China, which they now see as becoming global. And that, it seems to me, is what this NATO summit meeting, in some respects, is all about. None of this can conceal the underlying doubts and uncertainties that are there beneath the surface. NATO leaders have spoken about their support for Ukraine, the fact, as President Biden says, that they're going to provide Ukraine with dozens of air defense systems. Amongst those dozens, there are going to be apparently Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, and one is starting to get the sense that it is these Hawk anti-aircraft missiles that are increasingly going to make up the bulk, or at least a large proportion, of the deliveries. Now, without being ungenerous or unkind, the Hawk is a very old system, originally developed by the United States in the 1950s. In other words, in a completely different technological universe from the one we have today. It has been modernized since then, but apparently the last significant modernization took place as long ago as the 1980s, which is also, to a great extent, a different technological universe from the one we see today. These Hawk missiles and systems have to be refurbished anyway before they can be put to use in Ukraine. It's questionable whether they are capable of taking on Russian missiles and air power. And in fact, the Hawk missile system has been deployed in Ukraine now for some time. But the remarkable thing is that even though it has been present in Ukraine in some quantity, we scarcely ever hear anything about it. It's there, but it doesn't seem to do very much. And the Russians, I recall that they once claimed to have destroyed a Hawk system, but by and large, they seem to be ignoring it. Just saying. So, all of these brave statements in the NATO statements, NATO communiques, the documents that have been coming out of this NATO summit meeting. As I said, I will need to read them more carefully, and it may be that I have missed some important points, but I think in broad outline I've summed them up as they should be. Of course, outside the statements, we've had further comments from NATO officials, and there have been two which have been actually quite interesting. Firstly, various American officials are now saying that the F-16s that Ukraine is going to receive its first series of F-16s this month. It was much discussion about the F-16s appearing on the scene last month, but it seems that it is going to be this month that they will arrive, and supposedly some of them are already in transit and heading towards Ukraine. And there were comments about squadrons of F-16s being deployed, which of course makes it sound very impressive. But I believe that the total number will be around 60, perhaps less. Some are putting it lower at around 48. And the first batch, which is arriving this month, I've seen it claimed, will number a grand total of 6. Now, 6 F-16s are not going to change the balance on the battlefield, and Ukrainian pilots have previously said that they consider the F-16 a less effective aircraft than the Sukhoi 27s, with which they previously operated, and of course Ukraine has just lost 7 of those. So there we are. So anyway, Ukraine will apparently get some F-16s this month. The Russians will of course hunt them. Some of them will be destroyed. Of course, one cannot discount the capabilities of the F-16s entirely, but that they're being talked up, and one gets the sense that a lot of hopes amongst NATO officials are riding on them. Virtually everybody who has knowledge of the war and of the nature of this weapon system is agreed that they won't make any significant or important difference. Just saying. Well, I said that the Chinese would not be happy with what NATO is saying about them. And there has already been an article in Global Times. Now, this article was published before the NATO summit meeting. Rather, the NATO papers were released, but it anticipates their language. And I said it's an article, it's actually an editorial in Global Times. And it is accompanied by a rather vivid and sinister-looking cartoon in which we see a globe with a purple octopus spreading its tentacles across it. The octopus wears a hat, which is the hat that Uncle Sam is often shown wearing, and the octopus is clearly labelled NATO. So already the Chinese are making it fairly clear in this cartoon what they think of NATO. But anyway, we go on to read in the editorial comments like this. NATO is the product of camp confrontation and group politics and stands in the opposite of the general global trend as well as the aspiration of people. No matter how hard it tries to present itself as a peacekeeping organisation, it cannot hide its true nature as a war machine. NATO's so-called security comes at the expense of the security of other countries. That is a comment, by the way, that the Russians repeatedly make, and now we see the Chinese saying the same thing, that NATO, in its quest for absolute security for itself and for member states, disregards and undermines the security of all other countries. Many of the security anxieties peddled by NATO are created by the organisation itself. We will not speculate on whether NATO will make it to 76 alive, but it is certain that NATO will not move peacefully into the future. It needs to create continuously more enemies and greater crises to sustain its existence. Not content with dividing Europe, NATO is also seeking to incite conflicts and confrontations in the Asia-Pacific region. And then the article goes on to say Biden announced that the United States will provide historic assistance to Ukraine along with its allies, including allocating $1 billion to strengthen Ukraine's air defense system. In addition, an official from the United States Department of State said before the summit that some of China's threats will be reflected in the communique, which is just cliches. Now, providing assistance to Ukraine, increasing military spending, and hyping up the China threat are the three lifelines of NATO. NATO relies on these three lifelines to maintain a high level of strategic binding with the United States, serving as a tool for the United States to confront, control, and suppress other countries. Now, you might disagree or might be uncomfortable with some of the language used here, though to be clear, I am not. You might find some points of nuance with which you might think the Chinese are perhaps going too far. But anybody who tries to take an objective view of global events cannot fail to see the force of these points that are being made by Global Times in this editorial. In my opinion, NATO should have been wound up after the Cold War, just as the Warsaw Pact was. Instead, contrary to promises given to the Russians, Nikolai Petro and a co-author have done a fine article discussing the various promises that the Russians were given at the end of the Cold War about NATO not being extended eastwards. Anyway, despite all of those articles, all those promises, NATO did expand eastwards, and it expanded eastwards into Ukraine and Georgia, or sought to do so, despite receiving repeated warnings from the Russians that this was a red line. And NATO ignored that red line, and the result was a war in Georgia in 2008 and a war in Ukraine, which we are seeing now. And despite that, despite the fact that NATO, through the very act of its expansion, in effect provoked a war, a fact which sometimes even NATO officials inadvertently acknowledge. Jens Stoltenberg himself did that a few months ago. Nonetheless, NATO still insists that it is a peaceful alliance, that it only seeks to maintain peace, that it is not looking to create divisions in the world, and that it is a force for stability, when it obviously is not. And just as Global Times says, NATO is now bringing this same disastrous mix of policies, aggressive policies of bloc confrontation, to call them bluntly by the names that they deserve. Anyway, is now intent on bringing these same policies to the Asia-Pacific region, which of course has nothing to do with the North Atlantic area, which it was originally created to defend. And of course, in doing this, NATO, the United States, is seeking to forge regional alliances. It already, of course, the United States already has alliances with Japan and South Korea. It's now drawing the Philippines into its alliance system, resulting in an increasingly dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Philippines, rather between China and the Philippines, one which potentially could draw in the United States as well. And to what purpose and for what end exactly? Over Taiwan, the United States supposedly acknowledges that Taiwan is a part of China and admits that Beijing is the capital of China, and that the legitimate government of this whole of China, of which Taiwan is a part, is the existing government in Beijing. So why is the United States drifting into a confrontation with China over Taiwan, especially given that until recently the situation there was stable? Why is the United States talking about bringing NATO to the Pacific region? Why are NATO officials talking in the same way? Well, a Swedish official has now come forward and said that one of the reasons why Sweden wants NATO to start taking a more aggressive line against China is because European NATO member states need to do that in order to convince Donald Trump of NATO's usefulness. I have to say, the convoluted logic here, the logic here seems to me so crazy that I'm not even going to try to debate or analyze it. But anyway, there we are, a drift towards confrontation in the Pacific, on top of the already existing confrontation that NATO is facing in Europe. The struggle in Europe, the conflict with Russia in Europe is going badly. So what does NATO do? It decides to move east and invite a confrontation with an even more powerful country, in fact, a much more powerful country than Russia is. Even though, beyond that, one gets the sense that most of the nations in the region really do not want to be drawn into a conflict of this sort. Anyway, there we are. So that was NATO. This is the NATO summit meeting that has taken place in Washington. Ukraine obviously has not joined NATO. Promise that one day Ukraine will join NATO is being reaffirmed, even though, as I said, making that promise merely ensures that the war in Ukraine will continue, given the extent to which NATO membership of Ukraine is for Russia a red line. And a powerful letter, which has just been published, signed by all sorts of wise, important scholars, people like Professor Mearsheimer, George Beebe, Ian Proud, the British diplomat, Jack Matlock, all sorts of people, Anatole Lieven. It's appeared in The Guardian, and it's appeared in Britain, and I'm sure it's appeared in other places, including in the United States. A powerful, eloquent, and brilliant letter urging the Western powers to seek peace in Ukraine, and pointing out that the situation in Ukraine is deteriorating and not going in Ukraine's favor, and that this is an urgent and necessary moment in which to seek peace. Even though that letter reminds NATO governments of that very point, that constantly harping on about how Ukraine will enter NATO one day simply ensures the continuation of the war. Nonetheless, it looks as if the NATO powers continue to insist on doing it. And it's not as if they even have the means for all of these confrontations. Firstly, let me say that we've already seen in the various elections that have taken place in Europe, in Germany, France, Britain, the European Parliament elections, the national elections in Britain and France, the weight of public opinion as expressed in opinion polls, all of those things. We already see how the European public is becoming increasingly disenchanted and skeptical about the war in Ukraine. Well, we see that. There's also, incidentally, a point made in, of all places, an editorial in The Guardian today. It draws attention to the fact that this incessant lobbying that is taking place in Britain at this particular time for the Starmer government to announce an enormous increase in defence spending simply disregards fiscal realities. Britain is running budget deficits, its GDP to its debt to GDP level has reached a dangerous point. The economy is stagnating. There is growing disaffection on the part of the British public at the poor state of their social services and of their health system. This is not the time to talk about increasing defence spending on anything like the scale that these people are demanding, especially given that the British people and the people of Europe do not perceive that there is a direct threat to them coming from Russia and have become, as I have said, so disillusioned by the conflict in Ukraine. So, despite the fact that there is no appetite in Europe even for prolonging the war in Ukraine against Russia amongst the European public, despite the fact that all European governments face the same fiscal pressures as Britain does, only in some cases to a much greater degree, despite the fact that there are massive problems of logistics, recruitment, industrial output. I've discussed the enormous problems with shell production and how an article published by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, confirmed that NATO powers, the European powers, the EU, has been wildly overstating the level of its munitions production, its shell production, that the claim that it will be producing, that the EU will be producing 1.7 million shells by the end of this year is absolute fantasy. A more realistic number is somewhere between 5 to 600,000. Despite all of these problems, despite the fact that if the European public is not keen on getting drawn into a prolonged military confrontation with Russia, they are certainly not going to feel any appetite for a confrontation with China, which is a huge continent away and which is, after all, the country that produces many of the consumer goods that European consumers use. Anyway, in spite of all of that, they're all hitching for the ride. They're all saying that they're going to join in this new conflict with China. It makes absolutely no sense to me. And with all the doubts, with all the uncertainties, with worries about President Biden, with Prime Minister Starmer, as I've said, only just inherited his position, with President Macron increasingly looking as if he is no longer in full control of France, having effectively lost control of the French National Assembly, and indeed of the support of the French people. With all these weak leaders and discredited leaders, well, what we see is the constant drift towards confrontation with more and more of the world's great powers in more and more places, a sense that the West is not only drifting, but drifting towards the abyss. But there it is. Global Times refused to speculate on whether NATO would reach its 76th birthday. Well, I presume it will. I mean, I can't quite bring myself to believe that it will be gone in a year. But to be clear, NATO is living dangerously. And not only living dangerously, but by living dangerously, it is spreading danger. It is potentially involving all of us in danger because it is taking increasingly reckless steps which it is beyond its capacity to fulfill. 6 F-16 fighter jets supposedly heading to Ukraine now, after Ukraine has lost already not only its original air force, but most, perhaps all, or nearly all, of the replacement aircraft it received from Eastern Europe. What are 6 fighter jets going to do? And how does this change the situation now? And how are fighter jets, even in the numbers that President Zelensky is talking about, he's demanded 128 F-16s, by the way. How is all that going to make a difference on the Ukrainian battlefields? How are all of those air defense missiles going to make a difference on the Ukrainian battlefields, given the growing preponderance on those same battlefields of Russian power? Well, there we are. That is what I'm going to say about this meeting. It may be that I will revisit this topic in my next video. As I said, after I've looked at the various statements, the actual statements that the NATO countries have produced, after I've read them through and analysed them properly. But I doubt that I will have very much more of substance to say. Now, there is one further point, however, I do want to make, which is specifically about France and the recent elections which took place in France. And in a discussion of those elections that I undertook, I think it was 2 videos ago, I mentioned that there'd been a dip in turnout between the first and second rounds, and that amongst the parties, nearly all of the parties, in fact, the main big parties, saw a decline in the number of votes they received in the second round as compared to the first, and that this indeed included the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, even though it came convincingly first in the number of votes cast by a significant margin, and even though it increased the percentage of French voters who voted for it from 33% in the first round to 37% in the second. Now, one of those very helpful people from the Duran community emailed me and suggested what I suspect is the explanation for this dip in the support, the votes, the number of votes for the Rassemblement National. And it's actually a very simple one, which is that in 37 constituencies, the candidate for the Rassemblement National did so well that he or she won outright in the first round. So there was no need to vote for members of the Rassemblement National to vote in those constituencies, because in those constituencies in the second round, presumably no vote would have taken place. So given that that is so, that is probably enough in itself to explain the fall in the overall total number of votes that the Rassemblement National received. Now, in the Daily Telegraph yesterday, there was a long article by the economics writer, one of the 2 economics writers of the Daily Telegraph, Ambrose Pritchard, about the election in France. Ambrose Pritchard is for me one of these most unusual people, in the sense that he is clearly extremely intelligent and very well informed, and at the same time wrong about nearly everything. But sometimes he does hit the nail on the head, and he does know France very well. I believe he lives there most of the time. And I thought in this article, he got it basically about right. He said that the election has rendered France ungovernable, that a much better solution for France would have been for the Rassemblement National to take power in a straightforward election win, such as that they would have deserved, that the electoral manipulation by the other parties to deprive the Rassemblement National of its majority or even of its first position in the French Parliament, that what it has achieved is to prevent the Rassemblement National winning the election outright, but at the cost of undermining France's stability, that Emmanuel Macron's position, far from being shored up by this result, as he probably thinks, has almost certainly been further undermined by it, and that as a result of this election, Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National, whose voting figures have surged ever since Emmanuel Macron became president of France, the Rassemblement National has massively increased its support over the period that Macron has been France's president, almost certainly and largely in reaction to the kind of policies he has been pursuing and the kind of personality that he has been projecting. Well, the Rassemblement National is now well positioned in for the next parliamentary and presidential elections, which will presumably take place in 2027. Now, I think that the long-term loser out of this process will be the left, the France's left. I think that the left are now in pole position to be blamed by French voters for whatever goes wrong between now and 2027. They're left with an impossibly awful choice of either trying to govern alone, in which case their government will undoubtedly fail because it lacks a majority in the French Parliament, or going into some kind of informal or even formal arrangement with the utterly toxic and universally loathed figure of Emmanuel Macron. And that is the worst outcome that the left can have. And well, by agreeing this arrangement, in order to form this coalition to stop Le Pen in this election, that's the disaster that they brought on themselves. How much better for the left to have left Le Pen and the Rassemblement National form a government and then to campaign against it and to position themselves as the main alternatives to the Rassemblement National in the forthcoming elections in 2027. But there we are. None of these people ever seek advice from me. Why should they, of course? They don't presumably think in that way. They have become consumed with the fantasies of Vichy and all that. And the result is that we have the result that we have. Anyway, let's move on and let's now look at what is actually going on in Ukraine. Because to repeat again, the Western powers, NATO, are talking mostly about Ukraine. This is the topic, as well as Biden's prospects in the presidential election in the United States. It is Ukraine that is, for them, the single biggest issue. Now, what is actually going on? Well, the last 24 hours have been pretty dramatic in the news we have been getting. And much of this is now confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry. But let's first of all talk about that part of the news, which the Russian Defense Ministry has told us absolutely nothing about. And that is the situation in Kharkiv region. The thing to say is that there was a lot of talk about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, that the Ukrainians were preparing some mighty counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region. They deployed huge numbers of troops to the Kharkiv region. There was talk that they were going to launch a counterattack, drive the Russians back across the border, push them out of Volchansk, retake control of Volchansk, and there were even some wild fantasies about the Ukrainians capturing Belgorod itself. And all of this timed for the NATO summit, with lots of reports that Ukraine was being pressured to launch this offensive by the NATO states, that NATO needed this Ukrainian victory in Kharkiv in order to make a convincing play for its continuing support for Ukraine at the summit meeting, which is ending today. Well, Ukraine has attempted to conduct offensives in Kharkiv, and they've made lots of sporadic attacks towards the village, the small village of Gluboka near Lipsy. And after a strenuous and exhaustive effort, and apparently in the face of horrendous casualties, by some calculations, they may have captured around 40% of Gluboka, small village in the Kharkiv region. But in doing so, they took their eye off the main battle, which is not the battle for Lipsy, which is a sideshow within a sideshow. It is the battle for Volchansk. Now, here we have to be very careful because there have been many reports about what's going on in Volchansk, but these are coming overwhelmingly now from the usual assortment of reporters, bloggers, mappers, including, I should say, Ukrainian mappers, DS being one of them, I believe. Anyway, they're all coming out with all this information. The Russian Defense Ministry and group of forces north, for the time being, are extremely reticent about what has happened. But briefly and in summary, this is what I am reading and hearing. Firstly, that the Ukrainians have now pulled out completely from the area of the high-rise buildings in northern Volchansk. The Ukrainian positions in the high-rise buildings had become undefendable. The area was all but cut off from supplies. The situation was deteriorating for the Ukrainian forces further south, and the Russians had captured several of the high-rise buildings within this territory and were bringing unbearable pressure on the men of the 71st Jaeger Brigade who were stationed in this area of the high-rise buildings. I've heard absolutely nothing about the situation in the aggregate plant, but it would be consistent with all of the other events and with previous reports that the aggregate plant is now fully under Russian control. I'm not sure of this. I'm not sure of anything that I'm about to say, but it does seem to me more likely than not that this is the case. Further south, in the lightly built up and wooded area to the south of the aggregate plant, which is in the loop of the Volcha River, the Russians have now fully gained control of all of that territory. They've also gained control of most of the territory north of the Volcha River in eastern Volchansk. The Ukrainians had been making various attempts to counterattack in this area. They briefly regained some ground, but the Russians have pushed them back. But crucially, and most importantly, even as the Russians a few days ago crossed the Seversky Donetsk river and established a bridgehead around the village of Bugrovata, which they have been expanding, the Ukrainians became distracted by that move, transferred perhaps some of their troops to hold the Russians in the area of Bugrovata and perhaps even counterattack there. And critically, facing an operational crisis in the Toretsk area further south, the Ukrainians taking the decision to redeploy one of their brigades from the Volchansk area to Toretsk. This created gaps in the Ukrainian positions south of the Volcha River, and the Russians have now crossed the Volcha River, and they have occupied a significant amount of territory in Volchansk, south of the Volcha River, including the main cemetery, some school and technical buildings and other things. I'm not going to get into an exact discussion of what it is exactly that the Russians control. And then there were more reports this morning. I want to stress again, I'm not in a position to confirm any of this, but there were reports this morning that alongside the Russian breakthrough into southern Volchansk across the Volcha River, the Russians have also crossed the Volcha River to the west, and that they're establishing a major bridgehead there as well. Now, if you look at some of the maps that some of the mappers are producing, and looking at all of the areas that the Russians are either in full control of in Volchansk or are contesting, then it must be said that it looks as if Volchansk, the whole of Volchansk, the entirety of Volchansk, may be about to fall, that the Russians have actually broken through. Now, a couple of days ago, Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen government, which has provided some of the forces that are fighting alongside the Russian army in Volchansk. This is the Akhmat Special Forces Unit, commanded by the Chechen General Abdi Alaudinov. Anyway, Ramzan Kadyrov published a message that suggested that Volchansk was about to fall. And the information we've been getting over the last 3 days, but especially this morning, is consistent with that information. So, a major Russian breakthrough, so it seems, in Volchansk. If the Russians capture Volchansk at some point over the next few weeks, if they finally break Ukrainian defenses in Volchansk, then this will be a very, very bad result for the Ukrainians. It probably will not open the way for a Russian attack on Kharkiv city. I don't think this was ever the Russian plan, but it would facilitate a renewal of the Russian offensive towards Kupiansk, and it would massively complicate the Ukrainian supply situation along the line of contact in the area of Kupiansk, and might make it easier, probably would make it a lot easier for the Russians not only to recapture Kupiansk, but to move further west, retaking Izium and Balakleya, the two towns that they lost, along with Kupiansk, in Kharkiv region, in the fighting that took place during Ukraine's 2022 Kharkiv offensive. And of course, that would bring the Russians once more in the area immediately to the north of Slavyansk. So, a major crisis for the Ukrainians in the Volchansk area. But note something else. Firstly, the Ukrainians, despite all the claims about their mobilization, are clearly still critically short of men. They found themselves again in a situation where they had to juggle forces between various front lines. So they transferred troops from other parts of the front lines to Kharkiv region. That enabled the Russians to achieve breakthroughs in other front lines. The Russians in particular have exploited the redeployment of Ukrainian troops from the Toretsk area to Kharkiv region in order to break through. In the Toretsk area, the Ukrainians are having to hurriedly send troops from the Kharkiv area back to the Toretsk region in order to stabilize the front lines there. And that has triggered a crisis for the Ukrainians in Volchansk. There are reports that the Ukrainians are juggling troops from Kupiansk north towards Volchansk itself to try to stabilize the crisis that is happening there. And as we'll see in a moment, that has opened the way for the Russians to launch another major advance towards Kupiansk itself. So the Ukrainians, despite all of the claims about their enormous mobilization, are still clearly desperately short of men. And this is consistent with a report I saw a few days ago from a Ukrainian official. He said that the total number of men that Ukraine realistically expects to enlist in the Ukrainian army as a result of the current mobilization is 120,000. Not 500,000, as was talked about last year, not 150,000 or 300,000 or 250,000, all figures that I've heard, only 120,000. Now that is not, it must be said, consistent with various other claims. I've seen reports, claims that the Ukrainians are saying that they're mobilizing up to 5,000 men a day. But I pointed out that the Ukrainians are probably saying that simply because they need to keep, or at least they need the appearance of keeping up in terms of their mobilization with the scale of their losses. And for the record, the Russian Defense Ministry, if you add up all of the numbers, is putting Ukrainian losses in June, this is dead and wounded, at 55,000, which I believe is a record in this conflict. I've said that if you study Ukrainian casualties now, they are running at around 1,500 to 2,000 a day. Sometimes they go above 2,000. So according to these Russian estimates, and we must stress these are Russian estimates, the Ukrainians are losing between 50 and 60,000 men a month. And we see that the figure that the Russians have come up with for total Ukrainian losses on the contact line in June came to 55,000. So, a terrible situation for the Ukrainians. If it is true, by the way, that the mobilization is only going to produce 120,000 additional soldiers, then Ukraine is only mobilizing enough men to cover 2 months of losses. Of course, it's important again to stress that when I say that, those losses include many men who are wounded and who will return to the military, though not all will. But anyway, 2 months of total losses, dead and wounded, is all that this mobilization looks likely to replace. So anyway, that is the situation in Volchansk. That's the situation in Kharkiv region. The Russians, as I said, are now launching a general attack towards Kupiansk. It seems that they've reactivated their forces near Kupiansk itself. They're not apparently seeking to attack the village of Sinkovka, which has been the place of much of the fighting, was the place of much of the fighting last year and earlier this year. But the Russians do seem to be advancing in all sorts of other places. I spoke some programs ago about how they seem to have either captured or be in the process of capturing an important village called Pishanye. And in addition, there are reports this morning that the Russians have now broken into Makeyevka, small town on the Zherebets River, north of Terny, by the way, where there was a lot of fighting earlier this year. And, well, if Makeyevka falls, the Russians will be on the Zherebets River, and they'll be able to push both north and south along the Zherebets River and the Oskol River. And it's been said many times that if the Russians establish themselves securely in a position on the east bank of these rivers, then other Ukrainian defense positions along these rivers become undefendable. And of course, if the Russians are able to clear the Ukrainians from the east bank of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, then the position of the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk becomes critical, and the Russians are also well positioned to cross the Zherebets River, which is not a particularly big river, and push on towards Liman, which they briefly held in the summer of 2022, and perhaps capture Liman simultaneously with their advance and capture of Siversk further east, and that would bring them very close to Slavyansk. So anyway, the key point is that even as the situation in Volchansk appears to be turning critical for Ukraine, Ukraine is facing a major operational crisis in the Kupiansk area, which, by the way, geographically, it should be said, is also part of the Kharkiv region. So, major battles underway there. But situation is getting very bad for the Ukrainians elsewhere as well. So, in the Donetsk region, it looks as if the Russians are continuing their advance in New York. It's looking increasingly as if the Ukrainians are unable to stop this Russian advance in the Donetsk region, despite this area being so heavily fortified. As I said, they've had to strip the Volchansk front of critical numbers of troops in order to try to hold positions in Donetsk, but it looks as if that's not enough, and that the Russians are slowly, well, perhaps not so slowly, in fact, quite rapidly, grinding their way through and are in the process now of attacking the main fortified positions that the Ukrainians have in central and northern New York, the village the Russians call Novgorodsky, also I understand. But however bad the situation is in Donetsk and in Kupiansk and in Volchansk, perhaps the most critical situation of all now is the situation, still the situation in Ocheretino of Avdiivka and that particular sector. About a day or so ago, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the village of Yasnobrodovka had fallen under Russian control. Before that, they'd confirmed that this village of Sokol had fallen under Russian control. They now say that the villages of Yevgenivka and Voshchod in this area have also fallen under Russian control. That brings the Russians to the very edge of Progress, the village which opens the way for Russian attacks on Selidovo and on Pokrovsk. And the Russians apparently have encircled or trapped a small Ukrainian force in the village of Novoselivka Persha, where there were reports a couple of days ago that some of the men of the elite Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade had abandoned their positions. I don't think one should overestimate this talk about a trap. We're probably talking about less than 100 men, so it's not going to change the outcome of the battle. But there are multiple reports that speak of Novoselivka Persha, a tiny place, by the way, as nonetheless a linchpin in the Ukrainian defense lines, such as they are in this area. And it looks as if in this most crucial area of the battlefronts, Ukrainian defenses are rapidly collapsing. To repeat again, Kurakovo, Selidovo, and above all Pokrovsk are apparently the Ukrainian army's main logistical bases in the battle in Donbass. There is clearly a major deficit in fortifications in this area of Ukraine. In fact, I read a rather exasperated piece, I can't remember where, pointing out that despite all of the claims that Ukraine would set up strong fortified lines following the failure of its own counteroffensive, of its own offensive in the summer of 2023, that it would, in other words, do what the Russians did when they built up the Surovikin line. The Russians created this enormous, elaborate fortified line across the whole line of contact, but especially perhaps in Zaporozhye region, though also elsewhere along the contact line. And it was before this fortified line that Ukraine's summer offensive foundered, though in fact they never reached its most heavily developed positions. But anyway, the Ukrainians were supposed to construct something analogous, and there were lots of reports at various times of the Ukrainians trying to do this, and I expressed deep skepticism about their ability to do that. I wondered whether they had the personnel, the engineers, the earth-moving equipment, the the amount of cement and concrete and all of that. And well, anyway, it's proved that they have not succeeded in creating fortified lines. So this area, Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Kurakovo, is looking like the soft belly of the Ukrainian army. And the Russians have almost broken through and are close to reaching it. One Ukrainian defense line after another, hurriedly put together to try to keep the Russians back, collapses. The Ukrainians have never found their footing in this area since the loss of Avdiivka, and it is now increasingly clear that their defense lines in this area depended to an unhealthy extent on the retention of Avdiivka as their major fortified position in this area. So this is the biggest crisis We will see how things develop over the next few weeks, but I see no reason to think that the trajectory of the war in this area is going to change. The Russian forces seem to be unstoppable in this critical sector of the front. Now, further south in Krasnogorovka, this long, painstaking battle to clear the Ukrainians from what the remaining areas that they control in this town continues. The Russians apparently have now captured all of the built-up areas. There's still parts of this park area in the north of Krasnogorovka which are still outside Russian control, and the Ukrainians still apparently occupy some buildings, low-rise buildings in the northwest of Krasnogorovka. The Russians have been taking their time. Obviously, the fighting further east, in places like Ocheretino, Novoalexandrovka, Novoselivka Persha, Sokol, all of these places, has been given much higher priority. Also, I suspect the fighting further south in the Novomikhailovka, Paraskovievka, Konstantinovka area, and in the road leading from Konstantinovka to Vuglidar, this area also has had higher priority. So the Russians, having several weeks ago knocked the Ukrainians out of their main defense positions in Krasnogorovka, have been taking their time to clear this town. But one way or the other, block by block, house by house, slowly, steadily, incrementally, rhythmically, as they would no doubt say, they're coming now very close to the point that they will do so. And these are the main areas of the battlefronts. Now, over the last night, there were more missile strikes by the Russians against various positions in Ukraine. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to revisit again the question of this missile strike that the Russians conducted in Kiev a couple of days ago, where nearly all the commentary and discussion has been about the strike on the children's hospital. Now, yesterday, I received, or was it early this morning, I received an email from someone who provided me with an analysis of the missile strike by Bellingcat, which sought to prove that the missile strike was carried out by a KH-101, a Russian KH-101 missile, that it was indeed a Russian missile that collided into this children's hospital. Well, there's two things to say. A lot of it is based on photographic evidence, and I am not, as I have said many times, the person to analyze pictures and photographs. I have great difficulty looking and reading and making sense of photos. I'm afraid I have vision issues which make this problem. And of course, I am not an expert in identifying missiles. And even with the best eyesight, I probably would not be able to say with certainty what sort of a missile this was. This article claims that the photograph of the missile that everybody is claiming is the missile that collided into this building. I say everybody is claiming, though I have seen no actual definite proof that it was this missile, just saying. But let's assume it is this missile. Anyway, there's this article, this analysis, backed by some outside experts, says that this photograph definitely proves that it is a KH-101 missile. And if you look at the angle and you look at the photograph carefully, it is definitely a KH-101 missile. To me, I must say, based on photos I've seen of actual KH-101 missiles, and I've checked photos since then, it does not look like a KH-101 missile. But as I said, what do I know? It may be that the camera angle makes it look different and it is a KH-101 missile. I'm not any kind of authority in this area. Unfortunately, I have to also say, I've now received reports from other people, at least as authoritative, in my opinion, as the Bellingcat people and their experts, but other people who say conclusively that it is not a KH-101 missile and is definitely a NASAMS missile. Well, as I said, I am not going to arbitrate or rule on this. Bellingcat also discusses various fragments allegedly from this missile, which supposedly prove that it was indeed a KH-101. But as the Bellingcat report itself admits, there are questions of provenance about these fragments. They were provided by the Ukrainian authorities. There are various photographs which perhaps show them in the location, but we can't be certain that these photographs, what these photographs really show us and of when these were made and of how they were made. And anyway, I'm not going to get into this. There are issues of provenance. As I said, I am not going to discuss and say conclusively that it was one missile or another, or who launched the missile or how it happened. All I would say is this, what I always say, this is a issue that can only be finally resolved as a result of a neutral, impartial investigation, which I'm afraid I am absolutely sure is never going to happen. And I don't think, I have to say this, that Bellingcat is a neutral or impartial party. I'm a bit surprised that I'm being asked to treat them as authoritative. I read many, many investigative reports in my time, and the extraordinary prosecutorial tone that Bellingcat's reports always take, including this one, just make me discount their conclusions. That's all I'm going to say. Now, let me repeat again. In my opinion, too much focus is being given to this incident. Whatever happened almost certainly happened by chance. I doubt that anybody was targeting this hospital intentionally, be it the Russians with their missiles or the Ukrainians with their air defense missiles. Almost certainly this is an unintended event. What is far more important about that missile strike is that Russian missiles, cruise missiles, KH-101 missiles, were able to strike targets across Kiev, but especially the ETHEREUM factory, in broad daylight without being intercepted. That is the most important fact about that missile attack. The attack on the Children's Hospital is a tragedy, but it's the sort of thing that happens in war. The fact that the Russians are able to strike any building in Kiev that they wish to strike, and that the Ukrainian air defense system in Kiev has collapsed, is, to my way of thinking, much more consequential in telling us what direction this war is taking. In war, accidents happen, mistakes are made, missiles hit wrong things, tragedies take place. Given, as I said, that this was an unintentional attack, I don't think that there is more to be said about it. Now, since I am on the topic of Russian missile strikes, one important thing has, however, happened, and that is that the Polish authorities appear to have rowed back on the agreement, if it was an agreement, between themselves and Ukraine to launch, for the Poles to shoot down Russian missiles heading towards Polish territory. The Polish defense minister has now come out and said that Poland will not do this unless it has the full backing of NATO to do it. And so far, to the best of my knowledge, no NATO state has come out and said that it backs this move. So I think that this was another one of these attempts by Zelensky to gradually draw in NATO states into the conflict. This one, for the moment, looks like it was stillborn and has been rejected, but of course it might at any time be revived. Anyway, there we are. Going back, a NATO summit which produced all the usual boilerplate points that we've heard many times before, that said nothing new and which doesn't seem to understand the realities of what is happening in Ukraine. Even as the West, NATO and Ukraine are losing one proxy war, they, however, seem to be preparing to get themselves involved in another conflict and potentially another war against another far more powerful adversary, China, towards which the people of Europe feel no special hostility and from which they feel no threat. A steady drift, in other words, towards disaster. And in Ukraine itself, well, there continues to be endless talk of stalemate, of the war having reached some kind of a stalemate. I can't see how people can really believe that based on what is actually happening on the battlefronts. Ukraine, according to the Russians, lost 55,000 men, dead and wounded in June. It is being pushed back all across the front lines. Its positions in Torets are crumbling. It looks like it's about to lose Volchansk. It's being pushed back, defeated, driven back, and weakened all along the front lines. And a couple of air defense missiles, including some archaic Hawk missiles and some refurbished F-16s from the 1970s, are not going to change that outcome. So there we are. That's me for today. More from me soon. Let me repeat again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Please remember that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to check out our shop. We have, of course, the European football final on Sunday. England is a party against Spain. And anybody who's interested can still find our series, our Football 24 series, in our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.